Unlike most mornings in my childhood, Christmas morning was a lovely experience. My brother and my sister and I would amble into the living room. The Christmas tree was lit, a fire burned in the fireplace, and my parents seemed to be in a relatively good mood. Immediately, we went straight to the stockings. In my family, my mother insisted that we could not start with the big ticket items under the Christmas tree. First, the stockings. And stockings, as you know, they're kind of like the appetizer of Christmas morning. They're filled with smaller things, like fruit and candy and walnuts and maybe some socks or just one tiny gift. But I remember one Christmas morning in particular, when the stocking held the oddest but most exciting gift. In my stocking on that holy Christmas morn was a pointer. You know, a pointer, kind of like the old school car antenna that had a little rubber thing at the end. And you used it to point to things. I can't tell you what possessed Santa Claus to give a kid a pointer, but I loved it. And I remember walking around the house all the next week, pointing at things. Would you get the milk from the refrigerator, my mother would say? You mean this refrigerator? The one right here? Or my father would ask, could you get the mail? And I would say, the mail from that mailbox? The one by that road? Yes, the only mailbox we have, Charlie. With that pointer, I imagined myself as Professor Indiana Jones, pointing to lost cities where secret treasures were buried. With that pointer, I had confidence, I had power, and with that pointer in hand, I had authority. Now, why in the world am I talking about pointing so dang much on this second Sunday of Epiphany? Look at the front cover of your bulletin. What do you see? John down there, right? Pointing. He didn't have a pointer, unfortunately. But he's pointing to Jesus. John is pointing to Jesus, and this morning's gospel has all to do with that act of pointing. You see, in John's gospel, John the Baptist is not the Baptist. Unlike the other three Gospels, in our fourth Gospel, John does not baptize Jesus. Instead, John does something different. John the Baptist instead is called John the Witness, which means that his whole life is a witness to Jesus, which means that he points with his whole life to Jesus. And that's what happens today. You can take a closer look at the text, but this is what you'll notice. It says, the next day John saw Jesus coming toward him, and John declared, Here is the Lamb of God. This is he of whom I said, after me comes a person who ranks ahead of me. Now think about it. This is the first time in John's gospel that Jesus appears on the scene. Before this, it's been all about John. But this is the first entrance of Jesus. And John points to him. But not just with any title. John says, here is the Lamb of God. So why does John call Jesus the Lamb of God? Well, there's some significance there, so let's spend just a little bit of time there, if you'll allow me. Because the first hearers of this gospel, The first hearers of this gospel would have heard Lamb of God as something very distinct and special. You see, this Lamb of God reference points back to the book and to the event and to the story of the Exodus. You remember the story, right? When God visits the plagues upon Egypt, and the Hebrew people living in Egypt are instructed to slaughter a lamb and put the blood on their doorposts and eat the lamb. Those who do this will be spared the final plague of death of the firstborn that God brings down on the Egyptian people. So, when Jesus is called the Lamb of God, those first hearers would have made a connection. John is pointing them to the story of freedom and release from death. John points to the Lamb of God. It's not just a story anymore. It is there standing, living, breathing in flesh and blood, a carrier of freedom and hope for all people. So John points, here, there is the Lamb of God. And that brings me to another thing that I think is important about this text today, and it has to do with the idea of ego. E-G-O. It's hard to point away from ourselves, isn't it? And I would think that the same would be true for John. I mean, think about it. Remember that John is not always characterized as the most docile fella. And remember that earlier in this gospel, just verses before, the religious authorities asked John if he is the prophet, if he is the Messiah, if he is the chosen one. They think John is the stuff. Now, if I were John and all those people wanted to shine the spotlight on me, I would have had to fight a very strong urge to respond, absolutely. Of course it's me. But the thing to notice is that John does not do that. In fact, a little bit later, John makes that famous line, I must decrease so that Jesus might increase. I must become less so that Jesus can become greater. But don't we want to be great? Don't we want to increase? Don't we want to point to ourselves? The ego is strong. Look what I did. Look what I did. And we learn it early as children. Watch me, as we learn to do cartwheels and dive off diving boards. And we don't really grow out of it. We take it along with us. Pointing to ourselves has become second nature. Facebook is partly about relationship, but Facebook is also about proving what we've done and what we're doing. And nowadays we have brands, trends, and looks that help people recognize us. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with being proud of who we are. We are important people, you and I, and we have value, and we do important things. But I think the word for us this morning, the word that John is pointed to, both figuratively and literally, is that there is a great amount of freedom in not claiming ourselves as the center of the universe. There's freedom in looking outward. There's freedom in not having to control every single thing. There's freedom and joy in putting someone else's needs first. There's freedom in honoring and accepting and hearing other people's perspectives and walking in their shoes. After all, in a me-centered world, how can we ever center heaven? What does that look like? Centering heaven, putting the kingdom first, pointing to Jesus before we point to ourselves. Well, here in the church, we're lucky to have an example whole book filled with characters to show us in their own ways what pointing to heaven looks like. Enter the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose life and witness our nation will celebrate tomorrow. When I think about a life that clearly points towards something other than itself, it is his life. Dr. King's entire being pointed toward Jesus. Realizing that for so many people, earth was not like heaven, Dr. King dedicated his life to pointing toward the Lamb of God, the one who allowed death and captivity to pass on by. Dr. King pointed to Jesus because Dr. King had a sense of a different reality. He called it a dream. Seeing people enslaved to stereotypes, seeing people enslaved to being treated differently, seeing people shuffled to the back of the bus, seeing people kept from voting, being kept from living fully and complete lives. This was not the dream of God. And it certainly wasn't the dream of Jesus. So Dr. King pointed constantly to a different dream, a dream that did not rob others from liberties, but one that ensured liberties for all. Liberties, liberty, libera, freedom. And I have a sense that that is what Jesus meant when he said, "Come and see." Those are among the first words uttered by Jesus in the Gospel of John. Come and see. You see, those disciples asked Jesus where he was staying. Where are you staying, Jesus? A better word would have been translated, where are you abiding, Jesus? And Jesus says, come and see. He says, come and see, because to follow Jesus is to see God. Come and see, he says. To follow Jesus is to follow Jesus into the very heartbeat of God. Come and see. To follow Jesus is to be invited into a love that is so big and so radical that you want to wash the feet of your friends. Come and see. Dr. King had heard Jesus say, come and see. He had heard that invitation. And so he followed, his whole life pointing toward God. Because you see, when we lose sight of where we're going, it's good to have someone point the way. I wonder what became of that pointer I received in my stocking on Christmas morning. I don't know where it went. And there are times when I wish I had it. I wish I had it so that I could point directly to God. I wish that I had it so I could point directly to heaven. I wish that I had it so that I could say, oh, God is right there. I wish that I could point to something, anything that would wipe away all the doubt, that would wipe away all the anger, that would wipe away all the violence and the prejudice, that would wipe away all the fear. Oh, how I wish I could point to something specific. Well, since John left the picture and since Jesus went ahead and died and rose again and ascended into heaven, I guess that something specific is you and me and this church. God has claimed our lives and has called us, each of us, individually and as a community, to be pointers. Can you imagine? Can you imagine people looking to you to be signs of heaven? People looking to you to be holders of hope and people who make meaning, examples of Christ-like love and justice. Can you imagine that God has made us worthy to join hands with John and Dr. King, pointing to freedom and equality, pointing to the dream that the world so often forgets? Well, you better believe it, because that's what happened. And it's an awfully big job, which is why we don't do it alone. If we are going to effectively point to the crazily diverse and radical love of Jesus, it's going to take every single one of us. So we come to church. That hymn just told us, what is church? A school for the faithful. And we come to church to be reminded of that dream. We come to church when we lose our point. And we come here to get a few pointers about how to live life, to remind us that, oh yeah, we are called to love God. Oh yeah, we are called to love our neighbor. Oh yeah, we are called to point to something bigger and better and different. And so we keep pointing. We may not be like John the witness, and we may not be like Dr. King the prophet, but we all have ways that we point toward Jesus and toward the dream that he dreams for us all.